The first Black Hawk landed on the hospital roof at 2:17 a.m., and every window in the emergency department shook. 30 seconds later, a second helicopter dropped through the rain, its rotors beating the darkness into a violent blur. Doctors stopped mid-step. Nurses froze beside stretchers. Security officers reached for their radios as armed Navy SEALs poured through the emergency entrance, carrying blood-soaked equipment and moving with the kind of urgency that made everyone understand something terrible had happened. Then the lead SEAL looked across the crowded emergency room, past the physicians and trauma nurses, until his eyes stopped on a quiet woman standing near the supply cabinet. He pointed directly at her. "Find the woman with the tattoo." Her face went completely white. Because she knew exactly which tattoo they meant. And she had spent 7 years making sure nobody ever saw it. Before we begin, if you believe people deserve kindness, second chances, and the opportunity to become more than the worst thing that ever happened to them, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. You never know when a story about one forgotten person might remind somebody that their past does not have to define their future. Her name was Rebecca Collins, and at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia, she was known simply as Becky, the quiet ER nurse who never complained, never joined the gossip around the nurses' station, and always volunteered for the shifts nobody wanted. She had worked nights for almost 6 years, long enough to know which vending machine swallowed dollar bills, which doctor needed coffee before speaking to anyone, and which elderly patients pretended they weren't afraid because they didn't want their families to worry. Rebecca was 34, with brown hair she kept twisted into a messy bun, tired green eyes, and a habit of pulling the collar of her blue scrubs higher whenever anyone stood too close. Most people assumed she was self-conscious about a scar on her chest from an old surgery. Nobody knew the real reason. Underneath the fabric, just below her left collarbone, was a tattoo. A black compass surrounded by a silver-gray eagle, with 3 small stars beneath it. And beneath the stars was one word. Beacon. Rebecca had not allowed anyone to see that word in years. Not since the night everything had gone wrong. 7 years earlier, Rebecca had not been a civilian nurse. She had been something else entirely. She had served as a Navy corpsman attached to a special operations unit, working alongside men who trusted her with their lives in places where one mistake could mean the difference between coming home and being carried home. She had earned the Callsign beacon during a mission in Afghanistan after leading wounded teammates through a blackout using nothing but a dying infrared marker and her knowledge of the terrain. She had been 27 years old, stubborn, fearless, and convinced that courage meant never being afraid. Then came Operation Lantern Ridge. The details of that night had never been discussed outside classified channels. What Rebecca remembered was the sound of helicopters approaching through a valley filled with smoke, the smell of burning metal, and the terrified voice of a young teammate named Matthew Hayes calling for help. She remembered running toward him. She remembered finding him trapped beneath twisted steel. She remembered being ordered to evacuate. And she remembered refusing. Rebecca had stayed behind for 23 minutes after the extraction window closed. She treated Matthew's wounds, stabilized another injured operator, and carried a third man nearly half a mile through darkness before a rescue helicopter finally found them. All 3 survived. But Rebecca didn't walk away unchanged. One of the operators she saved was her closest friend, Nathaniel Brooks. He later told investigators that Rebecca had saved his life twice that night. But the Military Review Board saw things differently. She had violated direct orders, compromised the extraction plan, and exposed herself and others to unnecessary danger. She was never court-martialed. She was simply released from service. The official explanation called it a medical and administrative separation. Rebecca called it failure. She returned to Virginia carrying a box of medals she never opened, a photograph she couldn't look at, and a tattoo she began hiding beneath layers of clothing. She became a nurse because she could not imagine doing anything else. But she stopped being Beacon. Or at least, she tried. At St. Catherine's, nobody knew about Afghanistan. Nobody knew about the missions. Nobody knew that when alarms sounded in the hospital, Rebecca's entire body automatically calculated exits, threats, blood loss, and evacuation routes. She didn't tell anyone because she didn't want admiration. She wanted peace. And for years, she almost had it. Until that stormy night in November. The first helicopter had arrived because a Navy training operation off the Virginia coast had gone catastrophically wrong. A special operations team had been conducting a maritime exercise when an explosion injured several operators and damaged their transport aircraft. The weather was deteriorating too quickly for the normal evacuation plan, so 2 Black Hawks were diverted to St. Catharines. The ER went into full disaster mode. Stretchers rolled through the doors. Trauma teams sprinted. Blood pressure cuffs tightened around arms. Monitors screamed. Rainwater mixed with blood on the floor. Rebecca moved automatically. She didn't think. She worked. She helped stabilize a wounded operator whose chest was barely moving. She inserted N4 while another nurse prepared blood products. She noticed a tiny change in his breathing before the attending physician did and immediately repositioned him, preventing his airway from collapsing. Then another stretcher came through. A younger SEAL was unconscious, his uniform torn open, his face covered in blood. Rebecca looked at him for half a second and recognized something. Not his face. His unit patch. Her hands stopped. For 7 years she had trained herself not to react to military symbols. But this patch belonged to the same special operations community she had once served beside. The man on the stretcher suddenly convulsed. Rebecca moved instantly. She ordered the team to prepare medication, stabilized his head, and noticed something nobody else had seen. A piece of shrapnel embedded near his neck was dangerously close to a major vessel. The trauma surgeon arrived seconds later. Rebecca pointed out the danger. The surgeon trusted her judgment. The operation began. For nearly 40 minutes, Rebecca stood beside the wounded SEAL, passing instruments, monitoring vitals, and remembering another night 7 years earlier when she had stood in almost the same position beneath a sky filled with smoke. She forced herself to breathe. She was no longer Beacon. She was Rebecca Collins. Just a nurse. Nothing more. Then one of the SEALs who had arrived with the helicopters walked into the trauma bay. His name was Jonathan Mercer, a senior chief with 22 years of service. He looked exhausted, soaked, and terrified. Not for himself. For the man on the table. He watched Rebecca for several seconds. Something about her movements bothered him. Not because they were wrong. Because they were familiar. The way she positioned the injured man's arm. The way she checked his pulse. The way she anticipated what the surgeon needed before being asked. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He had seen that kind of battlefield medicine before. Years ago. Then Rebecca reached across the table, and the collar of her scrub top slipped slightly. Jonathan saw the edge of black ink. A compass. His expression changed. Rebecca noticed. She immediately pulled the fabric back into place. But it was too late. Jonathan stepped backward as if someone had struck him. He stared at her. Then he whispered a name he hadn't heard spoken in 7 years. Beacon. Rebecca's heart stopped. Nobody in the room understood. But Jonathan did. He pulled out his phone and made one call. 5 minutes later, another group of SEALs entered the ER. They weren't looking for the wounded. They were looking for her. Rebecca tried to disappear into the crowd. She moved behind a curtain. Then another. But a tall officer entered the department and began scanning every face. His name was Captain Thomas Whitaker. Rebecca recognized him immediately. 7 years earlier, he had been a lieutenant. Now he carried the weight of command in his posture. He stopped in the middle of the ER. His eyes moved slowly across the room. Then they found Rebecca. Neither spoke. For a moment, the entire hospital seemed silent. Thomas walked toward her. Rebecca's hands began trembling. She wanted to run. Instead, she stood still. Thomas stopped several feet away and looked at the collar of her scrubs. Then at her eyes. He said her old call sign. Beacon. Rebecca swallowed. She told him that person was gone. Thomas shook his head. He told her that wasn't true. Then he explained why they had come. The wounded SEAL on the operating table was not just another operator. He was Matthew Hayes. The same Matthew Rebecca had rescued 7 years earlier. The same man she had believed she would never see again. Rebecca's knees nearly gave out. Matthew had survived that night. But his injuries had changed his life. He had spent years undergoing surgeries and rehabilitation. He eventually returned to limited duty and later became an instructor. Now, during the training accident, he had been injured again. And his condition was critical. Rebecca stared through the glass at the operating room. She remembered carrying him through darkness. She remembered his blood on her hands. She remembered the last thing he had said to her before the helicopter arrived. She had never forgotten it. Thomas told her that Matthew had spent 7 years trying to find the woman who saved his life. Rebecca shook her head. She told him she hadn't saved anyone. She had disobeyed orders. She had endangered the mission. She had ruined her career. Thomas looked at her with tears gathering in his eyes. Then he told her something she had never known. The official investigation had blamed her for the failed extraction, but the classified after-action report had later confirmed that her decision prevented 3 operators from dying. The military had never publicly corrected the record because of operational security. Rebecca had spent 7 years believing she was a failure. Meanwhile, the people whose lives she had saved had spent 7 years remembering her as the reason they were alive. The tattoo she had hidden was not a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of the person she used to be. Thomas told her that Matthew had requested one thing before every dangerous operation he participated in. He wanted to know whether Beacon was still out there. Rebecca covered her mouth. She couldn't stop the tears. Then the doors of the operating room opened. A surgeon stepped outside. Matthew was alive. Barely. But alive. Rebecca stood frozen. Thomas asked her to come inside. She hesitated. She had spent years hiding from that part of herself. But then she realized something. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting who she had been. Maybe healing was finally forgiving that woman for doing what she believed was right. Rebecca entered the room. Matthew lay beneath the lights, pale and unconscious, surrounded by machines. She took his hand. His fingers moved. Just slightly. Rebecca leaned closer. She told him she was sorry. She told him she had spent 7 years believing she had failed him. His fingers tightened around hers. His eyes opened just enough to recognize her. And with barely enough strength to speak, he whispered her call sign. Beacon. Rebecca broke down. Not because she was afraid anymore. Because for the first time in 7 years, she finally understood. She hadn't lost herself that night. She had found the part of herself that refused to abandon someone when everyone else said it was too late. Weeks later, Matthew survived. The story never appeared on national television. There were no dramatic headlines. No medals were presented in front of cameras. Much of what happened remained classified. But inside St. Catherine's, things changed. Rebecca stopped hiding her tattoo. Not because she wanted attention. Because she no longer felt ashamed. She still wore her blue scrubs. She still worked night shifts. She still drank terrible hospital coffee. She still sat beside frightened patients and held their hands when their families couldn't get there in time. But now, when someone asked about the tattoo, she didn't pull her collar up. She simply told them it represented a promise. A promise that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay when everyone else has decided to leave. Months later, St. Catherine's held a small ceremony for several medical workers who had gone above and beyond during emergencies. Rebecca didn't expect to be recognized. She had never wanted recognition. But when her name was called, the room became completely silent. Captain Thomas Whitaker walked to the front. Behind him stood Matthew, still recovering, walking with a cane. Thomas presented Rebecca with a small framed photograph. It showed 3 young men standing beside a helicopter 7 years earlier. All 3 were alive because of her. Matthew stepped forward. He didn't give a speech. He simply hugged her. Rebecca closed her eyes. For 7 years she had carried guilt like a stone inside her chest. That hug finally made the stone feel lighter. And that night, after everyone had gone home, Rebecca stood alone in the hospital parking lot beneath the Virginia stars. She touched the tattoo beneath her collar. The compass. The eagle. The stars. Beacon. She finally understood why she had been given that name. Not because she had never been afraid. Not because she had been fearless. But because when everyone else was lost in the darkness, she had kept moving toward the light. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may be carrying guilt from their past, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a person doesn't need someone to remind them of what they did wrong. Sometimes they simply need someone to remind them that they are still capable of doing something right. And before we reach the end, I want you to leave one special comment below. I choose to be a light in someone else's darkness. Because you never know who might read those words on the worst night of their life. Rebecca never stopped being Beacon. She simply stopped being afraid of the name. And perhaps that is what second chances really are. They are not about becoming someone new. They are about finally realizing that the person you thought was broken was the person who had been carrying you all along. 7 years earlier, Rebecca had run into the darkness because someone needed her. 7 years later, 2 Black Hawks came looking for her. Not because she was a legend. Not because she was a hero from some forgotten battlefield. They came because somewhere along the way, a group of wounded people had remembered the nurse who refused to leave them behind. And sometimes, the world may forget your kindness. Sometimes your sacrifice may never make the news. Sometimes you may even spend years believing your best moments were your worst mistakes. But somewhere, somehow, someone remembers. Someone remembers the hand you held. The life you saved. The door you kept open. The moment you stayed. And when the darkness finally comes again, they may come looking for you. Not for the person you used to be. But for the light you never truly lost.